Thanks, Jennifer. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are really excited to start our the State of Our Democracy lecture series. Tonight, we are honored to have with us Professor Frank Rogers as the first speaker. Excuse me. As the first speaker in this lecture series. Dr. Rogers is currently the adjunct professor at the Department of History and Political Science and International Studies at Meredith College. He's been in this position since 2005. He was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, and attended Holy Cross College, where he received his bachelor's degree in physics. Immediately after that, he was drafted in the military, where he served 4 years as an officer in the Air Force, most of the time in the air base in Okinawa, Japan. He completed his service as a captain in the Air Force. Soon after that, he enrolled in University of Virginia, where he graduated with a master's degree and a PhD in political science. Professor Rogers then went on to teach political science at Winston-Salem State College. And prior to joining Meredith College, he worked in the Directorate of Science and Technology in the Central Intelligence Agency. Please welcome Professor Rogers tonight. And I will stop sharing my screen so that all of us can.
All set?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening. I am very happy to start off this series. I hope you find it interesting and enjoyable. My title of this speech is American Democracy, neither fragile nor robust, but the system held. Although I have worked within the American government for over 20 years and taught political science at the college level for more than 2 decades, it's only been during the last couple of years that I have had any concerns about the long-term viability of our democratic system. The reasons for such concerns and the possibilities of why they have arisen at all is the subject of the talk tonight. Are the waning years of our democratic system now upon us? I hope not. Or like generations in the past, can we renew, rebuild, and return to a period of positive growth, technological innovation, and world leadership? These are questions that have yet to be answered. Beginning in January 2017 and lasting until January 6th of this year, the American political system has been pushed to its limits. The end of this period came after the November election, when President Trump declared from the White House that the election had been stolen and that result would not stand. He urged his supporters to oppose those results and later encouraged them to attend the January 6th rally in Washington, D.C., which he declared would be wild. And it was. That rally led to a physical attack on the United States Congress by thousands of fervent and angry Trump supporters, hoping to stop or delay the formal certification of the November elections. In between those two seminal events, the election and the congressional attack, there was a string of over 60 failed judicial challenges to the election results. Those court challenges did not in any way alter the fact that Joseph Biden got more popular votes and a majority of the electoral votes than had Donald Trump. Thus, there would be a new president, and a new administration was sworn in on January 20th. And now the Justice Department there is currently bringing charges against hundreds of the major activists involved in the January 6th attack. The American democratic system held. After watching the events take place on January 6th.
Oh, you're not going to believe it. We're down to one burner working on the stove. That's the only burner I could get a flame on. You'll deal with it later, but we're going to have to call someone to come fix it.
Oh, I'm just kidding.
All right. All I can say is
You want me to continue?
Yes, please. Sorry,
go
just
for it.
as a reminder, everybody, if you'll please mute your speakers.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. After watching the events take place on January 6th, many Americans asked the question, how could it have happened here? Here in the oldest existing democracy in the world, this economic powerhouse, the most powerful nation in the world, the nation that has promoted democratic principles and free and fair elections from Latin America to Asia and Africa. The United States had now experienced a very real and substantial threat to its democratic system, but the system has held. The intent of this talk tonight is to try to answer the questions, why here? Why now? What have been some of the primary social, political, and economic forces that may have contributed to this significant, but so far failed challenge to our American political system? We have a constitution which spells out in fairly broad brush strokes how the system is supposed to operate. But as history has shown, our political system has evolved over the past 200 plus years. Although the specific words of the Constitution have barely changed. During those 2 centuries, the United States has become more democratic, while at the same time, the locus of power and authority has shifted to that of the executive branch in the person of the president. What the Constitution means has changed over the years as our political system has slowly but significantly been altered based on new interpretations, new precedents. We have a system of laws and norms, and how those laws are interpreted and how those norms are applied has determined what type of country we are, what type of a political system we have. One of the most important attributes of any democratic system is the ability to vote, to choose our elected representatives by a free and fair election. When that process is undermined, so too are the basic principles which unite us. When the United States was first established, the right to vote was quite limited. First to most white men, then with the 15th Amendment to include men of color, finally to women with the 19th Amendment, and then in both law and practice to all adult citizens, regardless of background or ethnicity, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So in that nearly 200-year period, we evolved from a very limited democracy to a relatively all-encompassing one. But there was always a segment of society that preferred to limit the voting franchise rather than enlarge it, that preferred to have a limited national government rather than an expansive one. In recent times, that became quite apparent with the elections in 1980 of Ronald Reagan. A major element of the Reagan administration was to begin to try to shrink the size and breadth of the national government rather than enhance and expand it, as had been the case when Democrats like Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Lyndon B. Johnson were in the White House. It never really shrunk with Reagan, though. So as our system inched its way closer to those goals so vividly personified in the preamble to the Constitution, that of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, there was always the possibility of backsliding, of stagnation. But the overall trend has been positive. In the 20th century, there were few, if any, mainstream segments of the populace that were urging reversals on the nature and extent of our democratic freedoms. Some wanted to slow down the changes, but few, if any, attacked the bedrock of our democratic elements. But as the United States and the world began to undergo major social, economic, and cultural shifts from the 1960s onward, such as more rights for women, more rights and inclusions of people of color, the acceptance of gender fluidity, economic globalism, and multiculturalism, then the reactions to such changes became more increasingly apparent. Some segments of that society that had been dominant, the white majority, began to feel increasingly threatened, marginalized, particularly men without a college degree, who saw good paying manufacturing jobs being outsourced as globalization spread. And also the more conservative segments of the religious community who saw increased secularization threaten their basic values of family and community. This trend was not unique to the United States, as it was also taking place at various levels and to various degrees in other parts of the world, particularly in Western Europe. In 2016, we elected as president a person with no political experience and little, if any, large-scale managerial experience to be in charge of a nation of over 330 million people with an $18 trillion economy. This was a candidate who had lost the popular vote by over 3 million votes, but who had won the critical electoral college vote by a slight majority of less than 80,000 votes in 3 crucial swing states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. For the next 4 years, Donald Trump pushed the envelope on presidential activities and prerogatives with little or no opposition or even questioning from his Republican supporters in the Congress. In a 6-week period in 2020, President Trump removed or replaced 5 federal inspector generals from the Defense Department, the intelligence community, the State Department, the Transportation Department, and the Department of Health and Human Services. These are the individuals responsible for oversight over those respective agencies. Without oversight, democracy is weakened. Little, if any, oversight is ever encouraged or supported by a leader with anti-democratic tendencies. President Trump contradicted and dismissed his own intelligence community's assessment that Russia meddled in the 2016 election, arguing that he believed Vladimir Putin's denial rather than the intelligence community's conclusions. After Congress had specifically refused to authorize his requested funding for the border wall between the United States and Mexico, he shifted federal funds from congressionally authorized defense expenditures to spending on his 2016 signature campaign goal, the wall. Rather than have the Senate confirm his agency heads, he often appointed acting heads of many of the top federal agencies. His handling of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States resulted in the highest death rate of any nation in the world, along with the most cases at that time. Finally, in November 2020, when he lost the presidential election by more than 7 million votes and lost the Electoral College vote by the same margin he had won it by in 2016, he declared the election was rigged, that it was stolen, and he refused a smooth and peaceful transition of power to its successor. Another first in the history of the United States. In fact, following the election, he did everything in his power to contest the election results. From being involved or supportive of more than 60 legal challenges, which were all dismissed by district courts, appeals court, and even the Supreme Court at both the state and national levels. He even personally contacted Republican officials in key swing states like Georgia, urging them to challenge or change the vote totals in those states. The final step was his call for and participation in a rally in Washington, D.C. on the day of the formal congressional certification of the presidential election. He urged the crowd to prevent the certification, and they did, but only for a few hours, when they marched up to Congress, attacked the building, causing a temporary halt in the congressional proceedings. The rampage of thousands of his supporters was finally ended when reinforced police and National Guard troops forced the rioters out of the building. This near insurrectionist activity was short-lived, but it also clearly demonstrated that a well-organized and instigated mob can have a significant influence on our political system, particularly when the President of the United States is verbally undermining that system's authority and legitimacy. This response and action against the government is not unique to the United States. In fact, these political challenges to democratic systems are taking place in other parts of the world and have arisen at other times in recent history as well. Donald Trump is not an exceptionally novel phenomenon in the United States, but he has been one of the more effective elected leaders who has managed to couple a populist message with strong autocratic tendencies. We have had other populist leaders in the 20th century, from Huey Long and Father Coughlin on the left in the 1930s and 40s, to Joe McCarthy and George Wallace on the right in 1950 and 60. But none of them coupled their populist rhetoric with anti-democratic inclinations. This was the danger of Donald Trump, combined with his exceptionally subservient relations with Russia's Vladimir Putin, a relationship that has perplexed America's intelligence community. Trump was unwilling to even criticize Putin or admit Russia's involvement in the 2016 presidential election, despite overwhelming evidence to that contrary. I think if he had won a second term, these tendencies of his would have been either further advanced and further developed, and they had the real possibility of fatally undermining our democratic system. One of the most perplexing questions one can ask about this Trump phenomenon is, why did this happen now? And what can be done to ensure it never happens again? One of the more insightful explanations about this subject is recent work by Piper Norris and Ronald Inglehart entitled Cultural Backlash: Trump, Brexit, and Authoritarian Populism. Relying on extensive survey and election data, both in the United States and in Western Europe, they offer a very sophisticated and nuanced explanation of these developments, along with some conjectures on what to expect in the future. I'll try to summarize some of the more insightful explanations because I think it very effectively provides an understanding of how Donald Trump was able to take advantage of these trends and promote his somewhat anti-democratic and authoritarian interests. The two key concepts to understand these phenomena are populism and authoritarianism. Neither one is new or unique, both having been around for decades in various forms. Populism is a political concept that argues that the people should be the deciders and decision makers in a political system. And in the United States, they claim that that proposition is personified in the preamble to the Constitution, which declares, quote, "We, the people of the United States," and goes on to say, "do ordain and establish this Constitution," unquote. With populism, the problem comes in when you get to the question of how do you or how should you choose the political leadership of such a system. But populist leaders and proponents are major critics of established authority and the so-called ruling elite, be they elected officials or appointed bureaucracies, who they argue should not be the prime deciders. Donald Trump had consistently promoted those views, not only when he ran for the office of the presidency, but even after he won that office and he became head of that ruling elite. That contradiction never bothered President Trump, since he always argued that there was this long established deep state that really ran things, and he was constantly at odds with that nebulous entity as he pushed and pulled against the established political system. A populist leader claims that the people should rule and that he himself is the voice of the people. Such a proponent argues that in a true and effective democracy, then the voice of the people should be the dominant voice, not the voice of the elite or that of the bureaucracy. This is a slow but consistently insidious undermining of the institutions and practices of a representative democracy. This occurred in the Weimar Republic in the 1930s and in Rome with the rise of Mussolini, as those at that time somewhat young and frail democracies in Germany and Italy were undermined by the bullying and critical rhetoric of fascistic supporters. Similar trends are seen today in Turkey, in Hungary, in Brazil, as democratically elected right-wing strongmen begin to remold these somewhat youthful democracies into more authoritarian type political entities. Combined with the perception that the people should rule is the idea that the system is falling apart, that it's crumbling, or it's so corrupt that what you need is a strong leader to take charge of things and to make it right. As Trump repeated in his 2016 campaign, Washington was a swamp of corruption. And when he is elected, he would go and drain the swamp. So this populist approach is not a direct attack on democracy. The troops are not called out. The elections are not canceled, although Trump hinted at that at one time. But the institutions and practices are harshly criticized when they did not favor the populist spokesman. Thus, they argue many of the long-standing democratic norms and practices that we have had for 200 years, that they're failing and they need to be changed. Authoritarianism refers to the principle of near blind submission to authority, as opposed to individual freedom and thought of action. It is often linked to the personality trait that serves as a defensive mechanism against anxieties and insecurities. One response to that personality trait is to follow a strong leader who promises to deliver security, even at the expense of personal liberties. On the authoritarian side of the equation, you have several practices that too are not directly anti-democratic, but when carried out to their full potential, become exactly that. These authoritarian values include, first, the importance of security. Security against the risk of instability and disorder. For without security, how can you have an effective nation? Second, the importance of conformity to preserve tradition, to guard our way of life, to protect us from them, to protect us from these unacceptable changes that are occurring. And third, loyal obedience, loyalty to a strong champion who will protect the group and its customs. As Trump had said, Only I can fix it. This latter idea ties the concept of tribal unity to that of leadership. Tribal in the sense of a group with common culture, common beliefs, and common values that needs to be protected and defended. The best way to do that is with a strong leader. These authoritarian values combined with populist rhetoric can be very dangerous. It creates an image of a failing system internally, that the elites have let the people down, and that there's some outside threat. There are waves of immigrants and others that will weaken or destroy the system. Therefore, you need strong barriers against these forces. A leader with foresight and strength who can rebuild, who can restore the internal institutions and prevent change to the system. You need to give that leader loyalty and support to make the necessary adjustments along with extra authority to ensure they are carried out. The question then comes up, why now? I mean, change is not new to the United States. Our political and economic system has been changing quite substantially over the past 200 years. We have had immigrants flocking to the United States for centuries. Are there any social, cultural, political forces that could account for this current trend? Not only in the United States, but in other democracies around the world as well. And the answer, according to Norris and Engelhardt in their cultural backlash study, is that there are such forces. And that's what I plan to talk about next. Since the 1960s, there has been a cultural shift in Western society because of both enhanced national security along with economic prosperity. People feel less threatened. We feel safer and more prosperous. We are more prosperous. And thus they feel more open and more liberated. As a result, increasing generations since then have become more socially and culturally liberal. They have become more interested and more concerned about environmental protection, about individual rights, about sexual liberalization, about democracy and human rights, and particularly the rights of society's more marginalized entities, be they based on race, on gender, or physical limitation. Along with that trend, you had the movement away from the pre-World War II mainstream traditional moral beliefs and social norms that were based on family, on religion, on country. You had a slow but definite generational shift in cultural values from primary concern with economic and personal safety, and thereby conformity to traditional group norms, to a set of much more tolerant norms and more interest in individual freedom and socially liberal values. Some of the post-World War II developments that have helped drive this major shift in culture have been structural in nature. They include increased access to higher education, a shift from a manufacturing-based economy to a knowledge-based economy, a shift from a regional to a global economy, increased urbanization, growing gender equality, and greater ethnic diversity. These changes across time have shrunk the size of the population that still adheres to the socially conservative values of family, religion, and social obligation. One now can see those increasingly enlarged segments of each new generation who are much more socially liberal than their predecessors, our children, our grandchildren. The values and beliefs of the youth of today are very different from those of the pre-World War II youth, or even the baby boomer generation that followed World War II. The overwhelming all-male college generation of the 50s and 60s is now a minority in the higher generation population of the 2020s, where women now outnumber men by more than 5%. Took a while, but you made it. With many natural phenomena where there is an action, there is often an opposite reaction. The same is sometimes the case with major social change. A basic thesis of the Norris and Engelhardt study is that there has been a cultural backlash against this ongoing cultural liberalization. And that reaction became a driving factor in several anti-democratic and right-wing movements in a number of Western democracies, like that of the United States during the Trump administration. As these socially liberal values spread and increasingly dominate society through intergenerational population replacement, the traditionalists concentrated among the older and less educated population feel threatened and increasingly marginalized. Where they were once the dominant segment of society, whose core values and social mores were mainstream, now they see their shrinking segment of society being pushed to the fringes. This sense of loss, which is disproportionately concentrated among older generations, especially white men, those who live in rural communities, and among the less educated, this often generates feelings of anger, resentment. Thus, political leaders promoting populist rhetoric and authoritarian tendencies can take advantage of this resentment and gain their support. In the United States, many of the people in this category have come to be strong supporters of Donald Trump. What also became increasingly apparent, both before and after the most recent election, was the support of Trump by white supremacists. This first became quite public during the demonstrations in Charlottesville in 2017 and reached its peak in the January 6th insurrectionist attack on the US Congress, which delayed but did not prevent the last foremost step in the certification of the Biden electoral victory and the Trump defeat. It appears that with the new administration and a new attorney general, the Justice Department will no longer turn a blind eye to the rise in public activity of white supremacists, as had been the case for the past 4 years. Analysis of the 2016 election indicates that Trump's victory was built on the authoritarian populist faction of the Republican Party that had been growing for years. In addition, he exploited the cultural wedge issues about race, religion, and nation that also had been dividing American politics for years. Voting behavior in 2016 confirmed the existence of a large generation gap in the American electorate. The youth birth cohort was the least likely group to vote for Trump. The social characteristics of Trump's support were consistent with the social profile of those who supported authoritarian populist parties in Europe, white men and those without a college education in particular. Trump also got strong support from those who were doing poorly and for those who felt worse off. It is not just cultural factors that contributed to support for authoritarian populist values. Economic forces have a role as well. There is strong evidence that the least prosperous citizens in advanced industrial economies, especially the losers from globalization, provide strong support for authoritarian values. Back in 1960, Martin Lipset, a noted political scientist, referring to the fascistic and extremist movements in Western Europe of the 1930s, argued that, quote, extreme movements appeal to the disgruntled and psychologically homeless, to the personal failures, to the socially isolated and economically insecure, unquote. In Trump's case, the cultural backlashers and those with economic grievances were both there in this past election and in 2016. And they seem to reinforce each other. But the cultural factors played the dominant role in people's decisions to vote for Trump over Clinton. And I think a close analysis of the 2020 election will probably result in a similar conclusion. When it comes to possible policy decisions to cope with these phenomena, it's much easier to address economic grievances, provide jobs, social programs, improve educational opportunities, and provide support to low-paid workers. These things can begin to address some of those factors, but addressing the cultural dimension is much more difficult. The younger generation is the most liberal, but also the group that is least likely to vote in major elections. The older white generation, although shrinking in size due to natural forces, usually produce the highest levels of voter turnout, and they are the strongest base of support for the authoritarian populist segment of voters. In the United States, you also have the problem of structural institutions and practices that favor the more conservative traditionalists, which are dominant in the right. The Republicans have more financial support, and where they have control of state legislature, the inherent advantages due to highly sophisticated methods of gerrymandering. In addition, you have the electoral college system, which overrepresents the sparsely populated rural states. Finally, there is also the recent practice of Republicans at the state level of adopting laws aimed at restricting or suppressing voter turnout. Coupled with those practices, it is very difficult to come up with programs or policies to deal with the perceived loss of status, to change the views of those who feel increasingly marginalized and who believe that their very values are threatened. That will take cooperation and support from the political leadership of the nation. But right now, there's a high degree of partisan divide in the nation, with a 50-50 split in the Congress right now. Unlike, as well as in the population to a great extent as a whole. Unlike President Trump, who encouraged this division and who took advantage of it, President Biden is trying to close that political gap and encourage bipartisanship in the US Congress and in the nation as a whole. He argues he's coming up with programs and policies not for Democratic states or not for Democrats, but for all Americans. But if Congress stays divided, or if the Republicans can gain control of at least one of the two houses in the 2022 election, then the reestablishment of the more democratic norms and precedents that were sorely challenged these last 4 years will be more problematic. This tectonic shifting of cultural traditions from the more conservative, traditional to the more inclusively liberating has little chance of regressing in the near future. But at the same time, the underlying bedrock of resentment and anger among the traditionalists will continue to smolder. The question in the United States is, how much anti-democratic pressure will that have on the structure and practices of our political system now that its primary spokesman, Donald Trump, no longer holds public office? One initial and somewhat preliminary assertion is that the democratic system has held. The 2020 presidential election was one that was free and fair and attested to by the decisions and actions of public officials, Republicans and Democrats at the state and local level who managed those elections, along with a court system, both state and federal, which refused to accept claims of cheating and fraud that were completely devoid of evidence. Thanks to the false claims of Donald Trump, along with many top Republican officials, that the election was fraudulent, many of his supporters really believe that he actually won the election and that he should have retained the office of the presidency. But the rest of the country is moving on. A new administration is in place, and President Biden now has the task of coping with the myriad of issues and problems that face every president. How successful he is at that task will help to ameliorate the fallacious view that he was not a validly elected president. A recent survey of over 1,300 Trump MAGA supporters conducted after January 6, 2021, indicates that 98% of them believe Donald Trump's election fraud claims. And almost all said that, quote, forces are changing our country for the worst. And, quote, the American way of life is changing, unquote. This foundational belief of cultural backlashes is a near unanimous perception of Trump's loyalist supporters. But this belief in election fraud is also widely held within the Republican Party. A difference today is that there is now no single leader holding office promoting those views. Donald Trump had the character and charisma to gain the support of these cultural backlashes, along with his authoritarian inclinations to bend the office of the presidency and the political system into a weakened democratic posture. Without the megaphonic capacity of that single most important political position to further promote those mendacious propositions and stoke the anger and resentment of that segment of the voting population that feels culturally marginalized, it's questionable whether these anti-democratic tendencies can retain enough oxygen to survive into the future. But there is little doubt that a more competent, equally charismatic, and authoritarian inclined leader like Donald Trump could be a serious threat to our democratic system. Whether Trump was an anomaly or a preview of what may be possible in the future, only time will tell. In time, the culturally resentful generations will pass on and be replaced by the more liberally cosmopolitan successive generations. By that time, no doubt new issues and problems will arise. But until then, let's hope that our current political leaders can make whatever necessary adjustments are needed to ensure that the second coming of Trumpism and anti-democratic tendencies are not in the cards, and that the democratic system as we know it will hold for another 200 and plus years. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. That was incredible. We are going to now, there are several questions in the chat. We're going to ask you some of those, and then people feel free to raise your hands or write your questions in the chat, and we can ask them, or you can ask them directly to Frank. Wow. Jennifer, do you want to start?
Anne asks, has a couple questions, but her first question is President Biden trying to recalibrate the power structure of the government? Is he relinquishing power in the presidency? And if so, how?
I don't know yet. The history has been presidents don't give up power, unfortunately. Trump, though, really pushed the envelope on things. He did things that were never done before. No president has ever got away with spending federal dollars that weren't congressionally authorized. Nixon tried it, but Congress caught him on that and made him change. Unfortunately, in Trump's case, Congress didn't take any action against some of the things he did. He established very borderline precedents that really pushed the envelope of what is truly a truly democratic system. He pushed it close to that of being more authoritarian system. Biden's been around a long time. I think few expected Biden to be really as liberal as some of his recent programs have been. So we don't know what Biden will be a year from now or 2 years from now. So I don't know. We'll have to wait and see.
Anne also asks, are democracy held, but by what forces? Was it luck or was it in the design of the government and institution? And kind of speaking to your last point, will it hold again if we get another autocratic leader?
Yeah, I think it held. It's not just luck. I mean, it's been around a long time, and we have very strong institutions, especially the courts. The courts held up. The courts did quite well. It also did quite well with elected officials at the state and local level, be they moderate or conservative Republicans who weren't extremists. They're the ones like in Georgia. Georgia's elections were run and held by Republicans, and they stuck with the rules. They weren't going to break the laws. They counted the system fairly. They counted the system 3 times, and they came up with the same thing. But unfortunately, now you have some very, very conservative legislatures in the Georgia State House. They just passed a bill, and one of the most serious aspects of the bill is they took power away from the Secretary of State. They could take control of the vote count if they wanted to, if this goes through in 2022 and in 2024. It's written so they could be the ones to certify what the electoral, who the electors will be that will go to Congress, regardless of what the vote count is. So that is very dangerous. I think the potential, if a lot of states do that and get away with it, the seeds would be there if you had another very strong, charismatic individual like Trump to get the type of overwhelming support he got. And anything else?
Which leads right to Edward's question: what's to stop Trump from running for president again in 2024 while losing the electoral vote, but this time the Republican state legislatures, such as in Georgia and Arizona, overturning their state's electors in favor of Trump?
Yeah. I think Trump will have a difficult time running in 2024. One is his age. As we all know, none of us are getting younger. And 2, I think he's going to have all kinds of legal, financial difficulties between now and then, based on a number of things he did while he was president of the United States. It's gonna, I think it may start to catch up with him. If that's the case, then he may have a difficult time gaining that same type of support. Right now, he is the dominant Republican still in name. Other the conservative Republicans would like to succeed him, but none of them have that special magic like charisma he had, that attracts people to him, to them. I don't think another Republican would be that much of a threat in 2024 other than Trump. if he's not bankrupt and spending time in some limited facility. And anything else?
Scary thought. Isn't the Amy asks, isn't the anti-democratic activities now playing out in the states with voter repression laws? Georgia has one now where the state can overrule local electoral boards. So you've addressed that one about the local one, or about the opportunity to overrule the voters at that level.
Yeah.
If there are other questions, I think just feel free to unmute and
yeah.
shout it out.
I think a lot of those laws are going to get challenged in the court. That's one thing. Also, if the Biden administration can become extremely creative and pass that bill they have on elections, which is in the Senate right now, that would prevent a lot of those things. But there's a lot of smart people who are working for President Biden now, and they may come up with a way to try to push this through the Congress, if they can turn it into some type of budget reconciliation method, then they might be able to or else they could do away with the filibuster or get in a exemption waiver on the filibuster. If they could convince all the Democrats to go along on that, then that's an option as well.
There's another question regarding Trump's influence on the rest of the world, and will the anti-democracy movements, the authoritarian movements in other countries continue to thrive without somebody like Trump?
Yeah, I don't think he helped in all of the countries to a great extent. These were the strong men who came up in Brazil, in Turkey, in Hungary. They came up on their own. I don't think Trump really contributed to their rise at all. He associated himself with them, but I don't think he made a difference there at all. That it was based on some of the same internal cultural, economic factors in play in those countries as in the United States.
Okay, those are the only questions. Those are the last of the questions in the chat. I'll turn it back over to you, Krishna. Oh, Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins has a question. Do you think that there will be a conversation in the next few years about amendments to the Constitution to ensure that some of the weaknesses are exposed?
Well, yeah, I think they'll talk about that, but until you have some major shifts in the United States Senate, amendments to the Constitution are tough to push through. It takes substantial support, and so I just don't think it could be done. It would be done by amendments to the Constitution. I think the Constitution has the stuff there. It's how they interpret it and what laws states adopt in terms of presidents, how much the president will push his powers and whether or not the court and the Congress will push back. The Constitution's constructed so there's supposed to be a system of checks and balances. with the Congress, they never were willing or able to do that with Trump to any great extent. The courts played their role, the Congress, because the Republicans had enough votes there, and because of the filibuster, they weren't willing to try and place some restrictions and limits on some of the things that Trump did. Anything else?
No? Okay, well, thank you, Professor Rogers. That was excellent talk and the discussion.
Okay.
We really appreciate you coming and starting this series off with a huge bang. Thank you. And thank you all for attending. Come back here on Tuesday when Professor Globetti will talk about the Constitution, actually, and the partisan evolution, race, gender, and the American politics. So with that, if there are no further questions, thank you all for coming and joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night.